Welcome back to Nighttime History. Today we will be exploring the Potter's Workshop, a place where earth and fire came together to create the vessels that shaped daily life across centuries. From the preparation of raw clay to the final firing that transformed soft mud into hardened ceramic, the potter's craft was both an art and a science that required years of practice to master. Thank you for joining us tonight. Sit back and relax as we dive deep into the rhythms, materials and techniques that define this essential medieval trade, examining the workspaces, tools, processes, and knowledge that allowed potters to produce everything from simple cooking pots to glazed servingware that graced the tables of both peasants and merchants alike. The Potter's Workshop was typically located on the outskirts of towns and villages, positioned strategically near sources of suitable clay and away from wooden structures that might catch fire from the kiln. These workshops were often simple buildings, sometimes just open-sided shelters that protected the potter's wheel and drying racks from rain, while allowing smoke from the kiln to dissipate freely. The workspace needed to accommodate several distinct areas for different stages of production. Clay preparation occurred in one section, often outdoors or in a covered area with a packed earth floor that could withstand constant moisture. The throwing area, where potters shaped vessels on the wheel, required good natural light and was usually positioned to take advantage of windows or open walls. Drying racks lined available wall space, and the kiln itself stood apart from the main work area, sometimes in its own separate structure to contain heat and reduce fire risk to the rest of the workshop. Clay acquisition began the potter's cycle of work. In many regions, potters extracted clay from deposits on their own land or from common areas where digging rights had been established over generations. The best clay for pottery was found beneath layers of topsoil in beds that had been formed over centuries by the settling of fine sediment. Potters learned to recognize promising clay by its color, texture, and plasticity. Different clay bodies produced different results in the finished pottery. Some clays were naturally smooth and fine, suitable for delicate work, while others contained more grit and were better suited to large storage vessels that needed to withstand rough handling. Clay beds varied in quality even within a small area, and experienced potters knew exactly which deposits would yield the characteristics they needed for specific types of ware. The extracted clay arrived at the workshop in rough chunks, often containing stones, roots, organic matter, and other impurities that would compromise the finished pottery if not removed. The first stage of clay preparation involved breaking down these chunks and spreading the clay out to weather. Weathering meant exposing the clay to cycles of freezing and thawing, wetting and drying, which helped break down the clay particles and made the material more workable. This process could take months or even years. Some potters maintained clay pits where material weathered for extended periods, believing that aged clay worked better than freshly dug material. The weathering process also allowed some organic materials to decompose and made it easier to separate out larger impurities. After weathering, the clay underwent a process called slaking, where it was mixed with water to create a thick slurry. This slurry was passed through screens or settled in tanks to separate out stones, roots, and other unwanted materials. The screening process required patience and physical labor, as large batches of clay had to be worked through progressively finer meshes to achieve the desired purity. Some workshops used settling tanks where the slurry was allowed to stand, so that heavier impurities sank to the bottom and could be removed while the pure clay remained suspended in the water. The cleaned slurry was then left to dry to a workable consistency. either by spreading it on plaster bats that absorbed moisture or by allowing it to dry in the sun on beds of sand or fabric. Once the clay reached the right moisture content, the critical process of wedging began. Wedging served multiple essential purposes in pottery preparation. The technique involved cutting the clay mass and forcefully pressing the pieces back together repeatedly, using body weight and arm strength to work the material on a sturdy table or wedging board. This process removed air bubbles trapped in the clay, which was crucial because even small pockets of air could cause vessels to crack or explode during firing when the air expanded from heat. Wedging also homogenized the clay, ensuring that moisture and any remaining fine particles were distributed evenly throughout the mass. Inconsistent clay could cause problems during throwing, as softer and harder sections would respond differently to the potter's hands, and it could lead to uneven drying and cracking. Potters developed specific wedging techniques that became almost meditative in their rhythm. The spiral wedging method involved pressing down with the palms while rotating the clay mass, creating a spiral pattern that indicated thorough mixing. Ram's head wedging used a cutting and stacking motion, folding the clay over itself repeatedly. An experienced potter could tell by touch and sound when clay was properly wedged. Well-prepared clay had a smooth, consistent texture with no hard lumps or soft spots, and when slapped onto the wedging table, it produced a solid sound without any hollow pops that would indicate trapped air. The amount of wedging required depended on the initial quality of the clay and the size of the piece to be thrown, but potters typically spent substantial time on this preparation, knowing that proper wedging prevented countless problems later in the process. The potter's wheel stood as the centerpiece of the throwing area. In medieval and early modern workshops, wheels were primarily kick wheels, which consisted of a large, heavy flywheel positioned below the work surface, connected by a shaft to a smaller wheel head, above where the clay was centered and shaped. The potter sat on a bench or stood at the wheel, using one foot to kick the flywheel into motion while keeping the other foot braced. The momentum of the heavy flywheel kept the wheel head spinning at a consistent speed, though the potter had to kick regularly to maintain rotation. This arrangement freed both hands to work the clay while still allowing the potter to control the wheel's speed by adjusting the force and frequency of kicks. Throwing a pot began with centering the clay on the wheel head. A lump of prepared clay was slapped firmly onto the wheel head, sometimes with a bit of slip or water to help it stick. As the wheel spun, the potter wetted their hands and began pressing on the clay, using pressure from both the outside and inside to force the spinning lump into a perfectly centered cone. Centering required a delicate balance of pressure and timing. If the clay was off-center, even slightly, every subsequent step would be more difficult, and the finished pot would have uneven walls. Beginners often struggled with centering for months or years before developing the feel for exactly how much pressure to apply and where to place their hands. The clay had to be wet enough to move smoothly, but not so saturated that it became sloppy and lost its structure. With the clay centered, the potter began opening the form by pressing down into the center of the spinning mass with their fingers or thumbs. This created the floor of the vessel. The thickness of the bottom needed to be judged carefully. Too thin and the pot might collapse or crack during drying. Too thick and the base would dry more slowly than the walls, potentially causing cracks, and the finished pot would be unnecessarily heavy. As the opening was created, the potter's hands moved in coordination, one inside the emerging cavity and one outside, gently squeezing the clay between them to form the walls. This pulling motion gradually raised the walls of the pot, making them taller and thinner with each pass from bottom to rim. The shape of the vessel emerged through the potter's control of hand position, pressure, and timing. To create a bowl, the potter applied more outward pressure, encouraging the walls to curve out. For a narrow-necked jar, inward pressure at the rim brought the opening in, while the belly of the pot was encouraged to swell outward. Experienced potters could throw a wide variety of forms without measuring tools, judging proportions and wall thickness by eye and touch. The clay responded immediately to changes in pressure, and small adjustments in finger position could dramatically alter the form. Potters developed an intimate knowledge of how their particular clay body behaved at different moisture levels and throwing speeds. Throwing multiple similar pots required consistency and muscle memory. Production potters, who made large quantities of standard forms like storage jars, cooking pots or bowls, developed routines that allowed them to throw dozens of similar vessels in a session. They often prepared identical balls of clay, weighed to ensure each pot started with the same amount of material. The throwing motions became automatic, repeated hundreds or thousands of times until the potter's hands knew exactly where to go and how much pressure to apply. This repetition was both physically demanding and mentally focusing, creating a rhythm that some potters found deeply satisfying. After shaping the basic form, potters might add handles, spouts, or decorative elements. Handles were typically pulled from a separate piece of clay. The potter wetted a tapered cylinder of clay and pulled it through their hands repeatedly, stretching and smoothing it until it formed a long, curved handle of the desired thickness and shape. This pulled handle was then scored at the attachment points, coated with slip for better adhesion, and pressed firmly onto the leather-hard pot body. The joins had to be strong enough to support the weight of a full vessel and smooth enough that they wouldn't create weak points. Spouts required careful shaping and attachment, with attention to how the opening was cut into the pot body and how the spout was angled to ensure proper pouring. Decoration of pottery took many forms, depending on regional traditions, the type of ware being produced, and market demands. Some decoration occurred while the pot was still on the wheel. Potters might use ribs, combs, or pointed tools to incise lines, create grooves, or stamp patterns into the spinning clay. Rouletting involved pressing a carved wooden wheel against the rotating pot to create repeating patterns. These techniques had to be performed while the clay was still soft enough to take impressions but firm enough to hold its shape. Other decoration happened after the pot was removed from the wheel and had stiffened to leather, hard consistency. At this stage, potters might carve more detailed designs, add applied decoration like stamped medallions or sprigs of clay, or create slip-trailing patterns by squeezing liquid clay through a nozzle onto the surface. Once thrown and decorated, pots entered a critical drying phase. Drying had to happen slowly and evenly to prevent cracking. Freshly thrown pots were extremely fragile and were left on boards or bats to stiffen slightly before being moved. In the workshop, drying racks provided storage for dozens or even hundreds of pots at various stages of drying. The racks were positioned away from direct sunlight and drafts, which could cause one side of a pot to dry faster than another, creating stresses that led to warping or cracking. In damp weather, drying could take weeks. In dry conditions, potters sometimes covered pieces with damp cloths to slow the process and ensure evenness. Handles and attachments required special attention because the joined clay tended to dry at different rates than the main body. Let's stop here for just a moment. If you're enjoying this journey into the potter's workshop and finding yourself drifting off to the rhythms of these ancient processes, we'd love for you to join our community of nighttime travelers. Please consider subscribing and turning on notifications to support our channel and catch future episodes. If you're finding this soothing, a like on the video helps us continue creating this content. Feel free to let us know in the comments where you're settling in to sleep tonight and what time it is in your part of the world. Now, let's continue our exploration of the potter's craft. Glazing represented one of the most complex and variable aspects of pottery production. Not all pottery was glazed. Many utilitarian wares, especially in earlier periods and among less wealthy customers, remained unglazed earthenware with porous bodies. However, glazed pottery offered significant advantages. A properly applied and fired glaze created a glassy, impermeable surface that made vessels waterproof, easier to clean, and more resistant to acids and staining. Glazes also provided opportunities for colour and decoration that enhanced the marketability of finer wares. Glaze recipes were closely guarded secrets in many workshops, passed down through families or carefully developed through years of experimentation. The basic components of most glazes included silica, which formed the glass, and flux materials that lowered the melting point of the silica to temperatures achievable in pottery kilns. Lead oxide was a common flux in many European pottery traditions, though it carried health risks for potters who inhaled glaze dust or absorbed lead through their skin. Alkaline glazes used materials like wood ash, which contained potassium and sodium compounds that acted as fluxes. Glaze recipes might also include alumina from clay to improve durability and prevent the glaze from running off the pot during firing, plus various metallic oxides to create colours. Preparing glazes required grinding and mixing raw materials to create a powder or slurry. Some materials needed to be calcined before use, heated to specific temperatures to drive off certain compounds or make them easier to grind. The glaze materials were ground in water using a mortar and pestle for small batches, or in larger grinding mills for production quantities. The fineness of grinding affected how the glaze melted and how smooth the finished surface would be. The glaze slurry had to be mixed to the right consistency, thick enough to build up an adequate layer on the pot, but thin enough to apply evenly. Application methods for glaze varied based on the type of ware and the workshop's traditions. Dipping was perhaps the most common method for smaller vessels. The leather-hard or bisque-fired pot was grasped with tongs and plunged into a container of glaze slurry, held for a moment to allow the glaze to adhere, then withdrawn and allowed to drain. The potter had to work quickly and confidently, as hesitation could lead to drips or uneven coverage. For larger vessels too heavy or awkward to dip, glazes might be poured over the surface, with the pot rotated to ensure even coating. Brushing glaze onto pottery allowed for more controlled application and enabled decorative techniques like applying different coloured glazes to different areas, though achieving even coverage with a brush required skill. Some pottery received only a partial glaze application. The foot or base of a pot was often left unglazed to prevent it from sticking to the kiln floor during firing. Interior glazing without exterior glazing was common for vessels like storage jars, where the waterproof interior was desirable, but glazing the outside was unnecessary and would add to material costs. Decorative techniques using multiple glazes included sgraffito, where a layer of slip was applied to the leather-hard pot, then a glaze over that, and designs were scratched through both layers to reveal the clay body beneath. The kiln represented the heart of pottery production, where clay and glaze were transformed through heat into durable ceramic. Kiln construction required substantial investment and skill. Most pottery kilns in medieval and early modern Europe were updraft kilns, Where the firebox was located at the bottom or side, flames and hot gases rose through the chamber containing the pottery and escaped through vents or a chimney at the top. The kiln structure was built of brick or stone, materials that could withstand repeated heating cycles. The interior was often lined with refractory clay that resisted high temperatures. The size of the kiln depended on the scale of production, ranging from small kilns that might fire a few dozen pots at a time to large structures that could hold hundreds of pieces. Loading the kiln required careful planning and experience. Pots could not touch each other or the kiln walls, as they would fuse together where glaze melted and made contact. To maximize space, potters used various stacking methods and props. Kiln furniture included clay stilts, spurs, and supports that held pots apart and allowed air circulation. Some pots could be nested inside each other if their forms allowed. Larger pieces were placed lower in the kiln where temperature would be more consistent, while smaller items might be stacked higher. The potter had to visualize how the load would heat and leave space for flames and hot gases to circulate around each piece. A poorly loaded kiln wasted fuel and kiln space and could result in uneven firing, with some pieces overfired while others remained underfired. The firing process itself demanded constant attention and could last anywhere from 12 hours to several days, depending on kiln size and the type of ware being produced. Firing began with a gentle warming phase where moisture in the clay walls and in the pots themselves was slowly driven off. Raising the temperature too quickly at this stage could cause steam to build up inside the clay and shatter the pots. As the temperature increased, the chemical water bound in the clay structure was released and the clay began its transformation into ceramic. The firing had to proceed gradually enough that temperature differences within the kiln remained manageable. Potters judged kiln temperature and progress through several methods. The colour of the flames and the glow visible through spy holes in the kiln walls indicated approximate temperature. Experience taught potters to read these visual cues. Draw trials provided more concrete information. These were small rings or test pieces placed near the spy hole that could be pulled out with a long iron hook during firing. Examining a draw trial showed how the clay and glaze were developing. Early in the firing, the trials would still be soft and crumbly. As temperature increased, they became harder and the glaze began to melt and flow. When the draw trial showed proper glaze development and the clay had vitrified to the desired degree, the firing was complete. Stoking the firebox required judgment about how much fuel to add and when. Wood was the most common fuel, though coal was used in some regions where it was available. The type and quality of fuel affected the firing. Dry, well-seasoned wood burned hot and clean. Green or damp wood created smoke and could deposit carbon on the pottery. The stoker had to maintain consistent heat over long periods, adding fuel regularly, but not so much that the temperature spiked or that flames impinged directly on the pottery and damaged surfaces. During the final high-temperature phase of firing, stoking became more frequent and intense to push the kiln to peak temperature and ensure thorough melting of the glaze. Kiln atmosphere during firing significantly affected the finished pottery. An oxidizing atmosphere, with plenty of oxygen available for combustion, produced certain colours and effects. A reducing atmosphere, where combustion consumed available oxygen and created carbon monoxide, pulled oxygen from the clay and glaze materials and created different colours and effects. Some glazes and clay bodies required specific atmospheres to develop their characteristic appearance. Potters controlled atmosphere through adjustments to the firebox, dampers and venting. Creating a reducing atmosphere might involve closing dampers partially or adding fuel that created smoke and consumed oxygen. The same glaze formula could produce completely different colours in oxidation versus reduction firing. After reaching peak temperature and holding it long enough to mature the glaze and clay body, the firing entered the cooling phase. Cooling had to be controlled as carefully as heating. Opening the kiln too soon exposed hot pottery to cold air and caused thermal shock that could crack or shatter pieces. The kiln was sealed and allowed to cool gradually, a process that could take as long as the heating phase or even longer. Some glazes required specific cooling rates to develop particular crystal formations or colours. Too rapid cooling could cause glazes to craze, developing a network of fine cracks in the glaze surface where it contracted faster than the clay body beneath. Opening the kiln after firing was a moment of both anticipation and anxiety for potters. Despite experience and careful control, kiln firings always involved uncertainty. Variations in clay quality, glaze application, kiln packing, fuel quality, or weather conditions could affect results. As the kiln cooled enough to open, usually after a day or more, the potter would carefully remove the bricked-up door or entrance and begin unloading. The pottery emerged transformed, the dull clay now hardened and ringing with a clear tone when tapped. The glaze colours fully developed and surfaces glossy or matte depending on the formula used. Examining the fired ware allowed potters to assess what had worked and what had not. Well-fired pieces showed even colour, properly melted and adhered glaze, no cracks or warping, and the strength expected from the clay body. Problems could include underfiring, where the clay remained porous and weak, or the glaze failed to melt completely, creating a rough, immature surface. Overfiring caused clay to bloat or slump out of shape, and glazes to run off the pot or develop defects. Cracks might appear from thermal shock or from stresses in the clay created during drying or forming. Pots that touched in the kiln would be fused together and ruined. Despite all precautions, every firing produced some percentage of wasters, defective pieces that could not be sold. Successful pieces from the firing were sorted by quality and type. The finest wares with the best glazes and no defects commanded higher prices and went to wealthier customers or to markets in larger towns. Seconds, pieces with minor flaws like small glaze drips, slight warping, or colour variation, were sold at lower prices but remained functional. Wasters were broken up and sometimes ground for use as grog, a material added to clay bodies to reduce shrinkage and improve working properties, or simply discarded in waste heaps that have provided valuable information for archaeologists studying pottery production. The range of vessels produced in a typical potter's workshop reflected the needs of daily life. Cooking pots in various sizes were essential items in every household. These needed to withstand direct flame and repeated heating and cooling cycles without cracking. The clay bodies for cooking pots often included more grog or sand to prevent thermal shock. Forms were designed for stability on the hearth and for efficient heat transfer. Handles or lugs allowed the cook to move hot pots, and wide mouths provided access for stirring and serving. Storage vessels came in sizes from small jars for spices or preserves to large containers that could hold grain, oil, wine, or water for extended periods. These required tight seals to protect contents from pests and spoilage. Some had glazed interiors for storing liquids, while dry goods might be kept in unglazed vessels. The narrow necks on many storage jars reduced evaporation and made it easier to seal the opening with cloth, cork, or wax. Large storage vessels might be built in sections because their size exceeded what could be thrown on the wheel in one piece. Tableware included bowls, plates, cups and serving dishes that brought pottery into direct contact with food and drink. These items saw intense competition from wooden trenchers and metal vessels, so pottery tableware often featured decorative glazes and forms to attract buyers. Regional styles developed distinctive decoration and forms that identified where pieces were made. Slip-decorated earthenware, tin-glazed maiolica or faience, and salt-glazed stoneware represented different traditions and markets within the broader category of tableware pottery. Specialized forms served particular functions. Aquamanils were decorative pouring vessels used for hand washing at table. Chafing dishes had perforated bases that held charcoal to keep food warm. Costrals or pilgrim flasks had flattened bodies and loops for carrying straps. Alembics and cucurbits were used in distillation. Chamber pots served sanitary needs. Each specialized form required specific knowledge to produce properly, and potters often specialized in certain types of ware rather than attempting to make every possible form. The potter's workshop operated within economic and social structures that shaped production. Many potters worked independently or with a few family members and apprentices, producing for local markets. They might sell directly from the workshop, supply travelling merchants, or take goods to market days in nearby towns. Some potters worked on commission for wealthy patrons or institutions, producing custom pieces to specification. Guild organisations in some cities regulated who could practice the pottery trade, set quality standards, and controlled competition, though rural potters often operated outside these formal structures. Apprenticeship transmitted pottery skills across generations. Young people, usually boys, though sometimes girls in family workshops, entered apprenticeship in their early teens and spent years learning the craft. Early training involved menial tasks like preparing clay, maintaining tools, and tending the kiln fire, while the apprentice observed and gradually began attempting simpler tasks under supervision. Learning to throw competently required years of practice. An apprentice might throw thousands of practice pieces before producing work deemed good enough to sell. Beyond technical skills, apprentices learned glaze recipes, firing techniques, business practices, and the accumulated wisdom of the craft that could not be written down but had to be experienced. The physical demands of pottery work shaped the bodies and lives of those who practiced it. Wedging clay built upper body strength. Long hours at the wheel required endurance and created characteristic muscular development in the legs from kicking and the arms and shoulders from centering and throwing. The materials posed health risks. Clay dust irritated lungs over years of exposure. Lead in glazes caused chronic poisoning if proper precautions were not observed. The heat of the kiln and the physical labour of loading and firing were exhausting. Many potters developed joint problems or repetitive stress injuries from the constant motions of their work. Despite these challenges, successful potters took pride in their ability to transform earth into useful and beautiful objects. Regional pottery traditions developed distinctive characteristics based on available materials, cultural preferences, and technical knowledge. The clay bodies varied from fine white firing clays to coarse red earthenware, depending on local geology. Glaze traditions ranged from simple lead glazes to complex tin-glazed wares that mimicked porcelain or featured elaborate painted decoration. Forms and decoration reflected regional tastes, with some areas preferring simple, functional shapes, while others favoured ornate, highly decorated pieces. Trade spread certain styles and techniques beyond their areas of origin, but many regional traditions remained distinct and identifiable even centuries later. Pottery production responded to changing markets and technologies over time. The introduction of new glaze formulas or decorative techniques could transform a regional industry. Changes in fuel availability affected kiln designs and firing practices. Competition from imported wares or from pottery produced in other regions drove innovation and adaptation. Some traditional pottery centres declined, while others thrived, based on their ability to meet market demands and maintain quality. The basic processes of preparing clay, throwing pots, and firing them remained remarkably consistent across centuries, but the details of execution and the specific products created showed constant evolution. The seasonal nature of some aspects of pottery work influenced production schedules. Clay digging was often done in late summer or fall, allowing the material to weather over winter. Firing schedules might avoid the wettest months, when maintaining kiln temperatures was more difficult and drying times were extended. Market demands varied seasonally as well, with some types of vessels in greater demand at harvest time or for preserving foods for winter. Potters adapted their production to these rhythms, making storage jars when needed for harvest and focusing on other forms during different seasons. Quality control in pottery production depended on the potter's skill and attention at every stage. Poorly prepared clay would reveal itself in throwing difficulties or firing problems. Rushed throwing produced uneven walls and poor forms. Inadequate drying led to cracks. Careless glazing created bare spots or excessive thickness that caused the glaze to run. Improper firing ruined entire kiln loads. Successful potters developed systematic approaches to each stage of production, maintained consistent standards, and learned from failures to avoid repeating mistakes. The best potters could produce ware after ware of consistent quality, each piece meeting the standards expected for its type. The relationship between utility and aesthetics in pottery production varied with the type of ware and the market. Purely utilitarian pieces, like basic cooking pots, focused on function, with forms refined over generations to work well for their purpose. The appearance mattered less than durability and heat distribution. At the other end of the spectrum, decorative pottery for display or for wealthy tables prioritized appearance, with elaborate forms and rich glazes that showcased the potter's skill. Most pottery fell somewhere between these extremes, balancing functional requirements with decorative elements that made pieces more appealing to buyers without significantly increasing production time or cost. Tool making and maintenance formed part of the potter's routine. Ribs for smoothing and shaping were carved from wood, bone, or horn. Wire cutting tools needed to be kept taut and clean. Calipers for measuring diameters had to be maintained. Throwing bats, boards that attached to the wheel head and allowed pots to be removed without handling them directly, needed replacing when they warped or cracked. Wooden tools absorbed moisture from clay and required drying and occasional replacement. The wheel itself needed maintenance, with the shaft and bearings greased and the wheel head kept true. Kiln repairs were ongoing, as the repeated heating cycles caused gradual degradation of bricks and mortar that had to be patched to maintain efficiency and prevent heat loss. The sounds of the pottery workshop created a distinctive environment. The rhythmic thud of wedging clay on the bench marked the beginning of work. The splash of water and the slapping of wet clay onto the wheelhead announced the start of throwing. The quiet hum of the spinning wheel and the soft squelch of hands moving on play formed a meditative backdrop. Tools scraped and tapped against leather-hard pots during trimming and decoration. Finished pots gave off a clear ring when tapped to test whether they were dry enough to move. The roar of the kiln during firing and the crackle of wood in the firebox contrasted with the quiet concentration of other tasks. These sounds, along with the earthy smell of wet clay and the acrid smoke from the kiln, made the pottery workshop immediately recognizable. Knowledge transmission in pottery extended beyond formal apprenticeship. Potters observed each other's work at markets and fairs, noting successful forms or decorative techniques that might be adapted. Journeymen potters travelled between workshops, carrying technical knowledge and regional styles to new areas. Pottery from distant regions that arrived through trade provided examples of different approaches and sparked innovation. Written records of glaze recipes or workshop accounts were rare in earlier periods, but became more common as literacy spread and potters sought to preserve hard-won knowledge. However, much remained experiential, learned through touch and observation rather than words or numbers. Economic pressures shaped pottery production decisions constantly. The cost of materials, fuel and labour had to be balanced against market prices for finished ware. Potters sought efficiencies that reduced costs without compromising quality that customers expected. Throwing multiple similar pieces in sequence was more efficient than constantly changing between different forms. Producing a range of sizes from the same basic form allowed flexibility in meeting different customer needs while maintaining production flow. Careful kiln packing maximised the number of pieces fired and reduced fuel costs per pot. Potters who failed to manage these economic realities struggled to compete with more efficient producers. The social status of potters varied considerably based on the type of work they did and their level of success. Master potters who produced fine wares for wealthy customers and maintained substantial workshops with multiple employees held respectable positions in their communities. Journeyman potters working for wages had more modest status, while struggling independent potters who barely scraped by, making cheap cooking pots, occupied the lower rungs of the craft hierarchy. Pottery work was sometimes seen as dirty and low status because of the association with mud and the physical labour involved. Yet the skill required and the essential nature of pottery products ensured that competent potters could usually make a living. Environmental impacts of pottery production were localised but significant. Clay digging created pits that altered landscapes. Wood fuel consumption for kilns contributed to deforestation in some regions, leading potters to seek alternative fuels or relocate to areas with better wood supplies. Kiln smoke affected air quality in immediate vicinities. Waste materials accumulated in heaps around workshops. While these impacts were minor compared to modern industrial production, they were noticeable at local scales and occasionally prompted regulations about where kilns could be located or restrictions on wood cutting. The transition from earthenware to stoneware, or attempts to produce porcelain, marked major technological shifts in pottery production. Stoneware required higher firing temperatures than earthenware, necessitating improved kiln designs and different clay bodies. The density and impermeability of stoneware, even without glaze, made it valuable for certain applications. Salt glazing techniques created distinctive surfaces on stoneware through throwing salt into the kiln at peak temperature, where it vaporized and combined with the clay surface. Porcelain production required specific clay materials and very high firing temperatures that European potters struggled to achieve for centuries while attempting to replicate Chinese porcelain. Each technological advance built on existing knowledge while requiring new skills and equipment. Pottery in the medieval and early modern world served functions beyond simple containers. Ceramic building materials like tiles and bricks came from related production processes. Pottery architectural elements decorated buildings. Ceramic stoves provided heating. The same basic skills of forming, decorating, and firing clay appeared in multiple contexts. Some potters specialized in one area, while others worked across various applications of ceramic technology. The principles of clay preparation, forming, and firing transferred between different types of ceramic production, even when the specific techniques varied. The relationship between potters and their customers influenced production. Direct feedback from users about forms that worked well or poorly shaped future production. Custom commissions for specific vessels allowed potters to showcase special skills and generate higher income. Potters in smaller communities knew their customers personally and understood their needs intimately. Potters producing for distant markets through merchant intermediaries had less direct contact with end users, but had to respond to market demands communicated through which goods sold and which did not. This market feedback loop, whether direct or indirect, constantly shaped what potters made and how they made it. Thank you for joining us on this exploration of the potter's workshop, where patient hands transformed soft clay into the vessels that held, cooked, and served the sustenance of daily life across centuries. If you enjoyed our work tonight and are still awake, please check out our other medieval content exploring the crafts and rhythms that shaped the world before the industrial age. And if you've fallen asleep, please relax and enjoy the sound of rain as you continue dreaming into the night.